This is, we do post these recordings out. Give us a couple of days to get them out. We will, we go through and we kind of clean them up a little bit. If you need live captioning, turn it on. We will be doing a $25 gift card giveaway. Couple pieces of information for you. One, we kind of select by people who are asking questions and stuff. So be active. Remember, you are here to learn, and the only way we can give you the best opportunity is for us all to work together. Another thing, one thing that seems to happen a lot when we send out these gift cards, they go to people's spams or out of focus, you know, the out of focus inboxes. So to keep an eye out, they go to the junk folder, etc. We are giving out a gift card or a grand prize at the end too. The way you get selected for that is to do your survey. So this time, again, we're doing the grand prize of a Surface Laptop Pro Go. Again, complete your survey. It is important for us to get your feedback. We do actually go through and read them, and we take a look and try to make things better for the next event. The comments you put in is how we actually select the next batch of speakers, etc. moving forward. We would not be here without our sponsors. Our sponsors are vital to the success of this organization. RBA, Synology, NICE, Plex, Concurrency, and Success are all our sponsors for this event. So thank you to all of them. I'm going to turn it over to Pat, and he's going to go ahead and begin talking to us about supporting collaboration within your organization. I will be breaking in from time to time with housekeeping around if we have questions, and then I will also be talking about the time. Okay. Remember to keep yourself muted, and please stay off video to kind of save bandwidth for others.
Perfect.
All yours.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Looks like we have a pretty good group here so far. And one of the nice things about the virtual environment is you don't have to worry about getting up and pushing the door open or hearing it slam when you join a session late. So today what we're going to talk about is how to support collaboration with inside of your organization. And so there's a lot of different items and tips and tricks that we'll provide here today. I'll say that this is maybe a little more entry level, if you will, or basic items to go through. But ultimately, you know, my goal at the end of it is that everyone learns one item and take away from that aspect of it. And there's some hidden nuggets and some features that you just may not be aware of with inside of the 365 stack, specifically the desktop applications, Teams, and SharePoint that can allow you to be more successful. I will go ahead and keep an eye on the chat as well. But again, we can certainly save some time for any questions at the very end of the session for us. I have some slides to go through. I promise you, though, we'll be heavy demo focused. So if you do have anything specific you want to talk through or go through, we certainly can do that. The first thing to make mention, there I am. I've been a certified trainer for over 10 years now, focusing on the Microsoft 365 stack. I work at an organization named RSM. I'll just have a few slides here. RSM is a global organization. We focus in on tax, audit, and consulting. I'm on the consulting side, focused heavily in on the modern workplace aspect of Microsoft 365, and I lead our Teams and Voice practice here. So with that, again, just some information about it. If it wasn't for them, I wouldn't have a job. So again, just a few items about the organization I work for. As you can tell, we do have a variety of different awards in terms of Microsoft related items. So I'll just go through those here. So let's go ahead and let's jump into the basics right away. So when we take a look at the basics aspects of 365 and some of the items to look at, I really want to take a step back and focus in on what does it mean to be a modern worker? What does it mean to be a worker in 2022? And when we think about what that means, I'd say that it means different than when we were a worker in 2019 or 2018. And even if you were in 365 back then, your world changed quite a bit. And so when we think about what it means, it's always mobile, always moving. And even now, it's how can I communicate more effectively? How can I use my iPad, or how could I use my cell phone? Maybe not to do your full job, but certainly parts of it. Living in a social network. I think this is one that's picked up a little bit of steam here in the last 24 hours, if you've been following anything with the Bluebird out there. But we do live in our social networks. And so keeping track of that, being able to communicate and get data much faster. I think that's the key with social networks. When you think about before the social network boom, or back in the 90s, or even the 80s, how you got a hold of someone, how you learned if they, their family was expanding, or there was some other major family event, was generally a letter or a card that came through. Now it's instant, right? And so we have that in our own world as well. And so when we think about that, consumer wise, we get our news much quicker. We get everything much faster. People expect that from a work side as well. And so it's just a matter of time for some of those personal items to come into the workplace. The best example I can share for this is some of the tools that you may use on a regular basis, like OneNote. For those of you that didn't know, OneNote was originally part of the education package as well as forms. And so as people started to use those tools, then you see it adopted with inside of the enterprise. And so it's not rocket science to say there's things from the consumer level that get brought into your corporate world, or your work world, if you will. And there's items obviously from work world that go into personal. Teams, for instance, as an example. Working on multiple devices. This is one that still shocks me. I still come across users, and I think back to when I was in college in the early 2000s. One of the items that I used to do back then, this was probably before the USB drive. In fact, it was zip drive, or the zip disk, iOmega zip disk for it. But with that, I think it was called the zip disk. Anyways, it was bigger than a floppy, but I don't remember exactly what it was. But with that, the key thing here is, if you needed to get something to yourself on another device, a lot of us emailed that document back and forth. And if I went back in time and I talked to College Pat and I said, hey, in the 21st century, or when we come into the actual 2020s, I will be able to save a file in a central location and access it on any device without having to email it to myself. Like, mind blown. And so we think about this, that there's a lot of us that still email files or email items back and forth, and that's not the most efficient use of our time. The other aspect of it is working with outside individuals to accomplish our goals. This is one where, I think we see it a lot and we're not good at it. I think a lot of organizations struggle with how do they work with outside parties? How do they communicate with outside parties? How do they collect that information? Specifically now that the world is a little bit different, that now you can work with an outside party that's not across town, where they can meet together. Maybe they're across the country or across the world. So how do we do that? And how do we do that in the most efficient way possible for us? I'm not going to focus in on security, not to plug a future session. My colleague Jonathan and I are doing a talk at 1 o'clock to talk about the security side of 365. So a lot of the items I will talk about is, let's do this. It's wide open. But then, of course, there's that asterisk on how do we do it securely? That's not what we're going to talk about here today in this session. So with that here, when we take a look at the different items in terms of different generations, this is one that I always like to make mention of for us. So I was born in 1982. That identifies me as a millennial on this chart. However, of course, looking at this, you could argue and say, you know what, Pat, there's elements of you that are Gen Z, there's elements of you that are Gen X, and I'll be honest with you, there's elements of me that are probably baby boomer altogether. But the important items to realize is that you do perform different and you have different expectations in different items. The fact in my mind that a millennial is the same as somebody that had a cell phone when they turned 18 as their first cell phone, or somebody that grew up with cell phones, is really shocking to me, because I think the cell phone has really changed a lot of the world that we live in. But when we think about it, this may work in your organization. This chart, for instance, may be a little bit off in terms of how your users look at it. But I think it's really important to take a step back and say, just because we do things one way, or because I like to do them one way, there might be another opinion to it. For instance, just because someone really likes a lot of tags and automations and notifications in their face, there may be other individuals that don't. And so being aware and being conscious of that. In the past, that would have been caught by a personality test or something of that nature that you may have taken with a team or a group of individuals. So with that here, the important items is that we need to identify what tools to use. And so, when we think about a tools for it, a hammer can do a lot of good things, right? Or a saw can do a lot of good things, but it can't do it all. And so the key item there is you need to acknowledge that there's multiple tools out there. And so 365 gives you this plethora of tools. And so understanding that email can't do them all, and develop some sort of easy diagram or easy use case in terms of what tool to use when, or more specifically, what feature should you be focused in on. There was I read a post a little bit ago, or maybe it was a white paper, I guess, a couple of years ago actually, on what tool to use when. And specifically, the summary at the end of it was that Outlook should only be used to invite a colleague to lunch, was I think the core outcome of it. So email can't do it all. When we think about email, we can send a lot of messages back and forth. Of course, we can communicate for it. We can't host an online meeting like we're in right now, but email does work, right? And so understanding where that fits inside of your organization, and maybe where it fits today and where it's going to fit in the future. One of the things that I always like to take a step back with is change is hard for a lot of people. And so by throwing some of these items out there that we're going to walk through and talk through today, that change aspect of it is really important, but coming up with those measurable steps in the future. Because if we start out wanting what's 10 years down the road, or maybe what's further down the road, keep in mind, Microsoft changes, technology changes. There's new tools, new features, acquisitions. Your organization changes and morphs. So maybe being a little more short-term and saying, what can we accomplish in the next few months in terms of that? So with that here, how do we come up with a diagram? The first thing is we need to understand, where are the business pain points, right? What departments are they with? What departments are the ones that are complaining the most? Is it a project management item? Is it human resources, finance? What other departments are out there? Maybe it's operations. If you work in financial services, operations that create the policies and procedures, a lot of that is, all right, how do they collaborate with lending, or the executive staff, for instance? Gathering those specific requirements. And this is one that I catch a lot of organizations having trouble with, is who's ever identifying or reviewing some of those problems or issues, they need to make sure that they also understand the technology and what the tools can do. And so if that person doesn't have those skills, then you need a partner or find someone that does have those skills. So if you're not built that way to gather those requirements, partnering up with someone that can have those conversations, and you can translate and say, all right, this is the tool, or this is the tool that would solve this specific problem. So with that here, when we take a look at collaborating, really from anywhere using Microsoft 365. So just some items to think about. Do we need to collaborate with some select peers, right? Maybe that's OneDrive or a group chat for that instance. Maybe we need to collaborate as a team. And again, team here can mean a couple things. If you caught on early, the definition of a team can mean a lot of different items. Is it a Microsoft team? Is it a team site? Or is it a team outside of 365 and it's just a team or a group of people for it? Should we start in the cloud? The answer is yes. If I hear one more person say, I save my files locally to my desktop and then I upload them, I'm going to lose my mind. There is absolutely no reason not to start and save a file directly in OneDrive, Teams, or SharePoint at all. It is honestly easier to do it now to make that happen. There's no reason for you to upload files. There's no reason for you to manually copy those files over. If you look at my desktop today, I'll be honest with you, I have files on my desktop. The files on my desktop are generally items that I've downloaded and I needed to use somewhere else, or I've downloaded them because I needed to put them in my expense report and I use that as a temporary repository. And then a couple times a month, I go and I just delete it because it's not something that I need. Starting items maybe as a team, real-time co-authoring, and real-time everything. I think that's a key item is when we think about how we can use it, real-time is important. The speed of everything is important. Us as humans crave instant gratification. And if you don't believe it, look back a couple weeks ago where the first thing I did when I woke up on a Tuesday morning was see if I was a billionaire and I won the lottery. And then I was incredibly disappointed that I didn't because they hadn't called the numbers yet. And so thank you, Minnesota, for that, I guess. But with that, when we think about we need everything immediately. That's just who we've become as a culture. And I think that's a little downside, I'll be honest with you. But at the same time, having those items available to you in real time is really, really important. And so by using Microsoft 365 can certainly help us out. So this is an infographic from Microsoft in terms of that. And what I wanted to cover here was just a few items here to take a look at. The first thing to focus on here is kind of this discuss directly in Excel. If I'm part of a finance team, I spend majority of my life in Excel. And so when we think about that aspect of it, Excel is a unique beast. And depending upon the organization, you may be running your entire business on Excel, or maybe you're running your entire business not in Excel, which I would be fascinated by because every organization I seem to interact with Excel is so vital to their workload. When we think about Excel, though, one of the items to think about is using mentions or at mentioning, calling out coworkers, making it so it's easier and that collaboration is happening directly inside of that file, meaning that I'm not taking that conversation outside of the file. So somebody else comes in, they can actually see the file itself. It's not a separate chat. It's not a separate, communication thread altogether. And so we'll talk through and see some of that here today. The other one, which I think is really a no-brainer here, is the aspect of viewing and retrieving your past versions of documents. This is one where version history has always been around. And so if you're someone that grew up in the SharePoint space for decades, you're used to version history. You've heard this talk over and over and over again. But version history means different things today. It is vital to the way you work with autosave enabled. When autosave is on, that version is incrementing and creating each and every single moment. And so when we think about version history, the times that I use version history now is not because I screwed up a document or I need to look at a different document. It's because, hey, Pat, I need to pull that document from what it looked like a month ago and bring it back. Or I need to roll it back to the previous version because I should have saved this one as its new name. And so that's a common scenario for you as well. If you haven't seen version history, though, in a modern format and you're used to the SharePoint way of right-clicking or clicking on the extended menu, the ellipsis, and looking at version history, there's other ways to see version history now that resonate with users a lot more efficiently. The last item to make mention about here for us, and this is one just some people may not know, and I know we talked about this with an Excel aspect of it, is actually drawing people to a document or drawing people to a specific comment. Mentioning individuals. We see mentions all the time, right? So whether it's in Teams when somebody's mentioning a tag or mentioning a channel name, or in a group chat and they're mentioning an individual. With the idea of mentions is there's a sense of priority. I'll be honest with you, I use mentions all the time in my email. It's a lot easier for me to say at Maddie or at Jonathan or at somebody, and then it automatically adds them to the to field. And I don't have to do two things. I don't have to call it out, mention it, bold it. Three things, I guess, from that aspect of it. So using mentionings are important. I also think there's people that overuse mentions as well. So that I think is the root of evil there as well. But I think when we take a look at it, these are really some of the core themes here for us that we'll start to see. The one item to make mention of and take a step back on is that whole governance piece. What do we need to look at, right? So where does IT do? What do the users do? And what do we rely on Microsoft for? So when we think about this, IT really needs to ensure that users have access to what they have, the compliance needs are set, and security are set. That's really what we're not talking about today, okay? That is what IT does. That's the governance aspect of it that's important. When we take a look at what users do, right? That's the idea of chatting and posting, email, document management, third-party applications, tools that they may use, interactions. And when we think about what 365 does from a governance perspective, really tying it all together is, hosting different items and different services, whether it's Exchange or Teams, documents that are stored in SharePoint and OneDrive and Teams as well, chat and post, right? So the idea of having that in a central repository, so wherever that work is being done, we have a way of seeing through and overcoming that. This is a really simple diagram here to look at. So this is available. It's an editable one. I'll get the deck uploaded to the shared spot so you can take this and add and remove as you need. When we think about it, giving users the ability to understand what tool to use when and where those items are. And so when we think about it, if you compare Teams to Outlook to Yammer to SharePoint, they have different focuses and different tools. And so here, when we think about it, if we focus just in on, more or less that collaboration with file sharing directly here in the middle, I think we can say, you know what, Teams and SharePoint, really good, right? They're the same. In fact, they're identical, right? And so when we think about it, where is that system of record? Where is that retention stored at? What is really that key that we need to focus in on? And then, of course, you have other items down at the bottom. They're kind of no-brainer. It shows that Teams does more, I guess, by having meetings and voice calls on there as well. But again, having a very simple, easy to consume diagram, whether it's pretty or whether it's really just black and white like this one, really helps users understand what should they use when should they use a specific tool or not. And maybe yours looks a little different. Maybe in your organization, Outlook, from that aspect of it is a little bit better, right, in terms of it. So one of those pieces just to be aware of for it. Again, this is not anything in particular. I'm just kind of an example for you guys to be aware of. All right. So when we think about what a checklist looks like and that best practices for us, the first thing we need to do is to talk to our users. We need to make sure that our users understand what the change is going to be. We need to balance our risks and benefits. So pushing users forward, although we see it as a benefit, in their line, it might be seen as a risk. Or we have other clients that we work with, and I was on a call yesterday where a client said, you know what, we want to move most of our files up to SharePoint Online, but we don't want to move our executive files because we just don't trust it. And with that, that's the risk and benefit. So, okay, that's fine. But what is the risk if you leave them behind? Also looking at, is there a way or a tool that you can manage those more appropriately? And the answer is yes. Using a phased approach, reinforcing with training. This is one big element here for us. And any of you that have been to one of my prior sessions before or know my background is in education and training, I'm really passionate about this. When we think about reinforcing with training, we are lifelong learners as humans. Most of us are. There are certainly some out there that want to just know what they know and coast through life. But for a lot of us, at least in technology, we're lifelong learners, and our users are that way too. But reinforcing with monthly or quarterly sessions to talk about what's new or what's available. I think at the beginning session, I think Michelle mentioned that there are 350 new features that have rolled out in Teams this calendar year. And honestly, when we think about that, that seems like a lot, right? But providing the knowledge and the guidelines of here's what those features are, here's how you can use those, and here's how it can help. It may not be a structured course. When I think about how training has changed, getting 5 days to dedicate yourself to training may not be possible anymore, specifically for a lot of your users. So maybe it's little nuggets in terms of how it can help out their day for it. And so today, that's what we're going to cover some of those on when we get to the demo section. I'm going to speed up a little bit because I'm slightly behind of my schedule here. So the first thing to really understand from a collaboration is this big elephant in the room for it. The big elephant in the room is Microsoft 365 Groups. And with that, I have a few slides that kind of talk about the fundamental items of groups. Since we're all Microsoft individuals here, probably more on the admin side, I might go through this a little bit faster. But if there are questions related to that, feel free to chime in and let me know. When we think about groups, a group is a collection of shared resources. And this is what gets us in trouble, is when you create a group, it doesn't just create one thing. It also doesn't just include one thing. So as an organization, if you say, you know what, Microsoft 365 groups are not for us, those are the things that you may not have access to. And so I think it's important, you have Outlook involved, SharePoint's involved, Planners involved, Power BI's involved, Yammer's involved. I love this Teams team concept is there too. I'm just trying to figure out if we can add another team somewhere in that aspect of it. But when we think about it, there's a lot of items that come with it. So when we take a look at what team or what a group rather really involves is if I have a file, it's going to go into SharePoint somewhere. If I have a task, it's going to go into Planner. If I use a discussion board, that's going to go into Yammer. Instant messaging is in Teams, business intelligence is Power BI, and then the one other piece is for surveys and forms, that's going to Microsoft Forms overall. So when we think about it, is all these tools make it really hard for users to have a good digital experience together. So that's why it groups them together specifically on the permissions piece of it. So when we create different items along the way, when a user goes to create a new team site, it's coming with a group. When a user goes to create a new plan, it's coming with a group unless they choose not to. Outlook, of course, you can, and Teams, it does automatically. Users generally don't have any idea what they're doing. And if you lock it down, then users really have no idea what's included. So, depending upon the way that you're provisioning, you'll have different results or different items. And with this, just as an example, if I create a group from Outlook or SharePoint, it's creating a handful of items. The SharePoint site, the shared mailbox, the calendar, the Power BI workspace, the OneNote notebook, don't forget about that. And then also the Forms workspace is being included. What it does not create itself is a Teams team, a planner, and also a Yammer feed. However, you can add a few of those afterwards if you'd like. And you probably have seen that happen. And so when we think about it for us, that's your quick rundown on Microsoft 365 groups. We could probably have a full 90-minute session on groups overall and how to manage those, but this is just more or less for your background. When we think about collaboration, SharePoint is really key there for me. Is when I take a look at SharePoint, it is that collaboration portal. And so a lot of times, this one at the very bottom here, I think is probably the biggest takeaway for most of us is using the word SharePoint is a lot like using the word Office. It means more than one thing. It's like using the term Microsoft Teams. I guess you could throw a lot of those groups of technologies in there. And so when we think about it here, we may be throwing around a term and our users may not quite understand what we're referring to. For instance, if I say, just put the file in SharePoint, users in my mind might say, okay, I don't really know what SharePoint is. Is it the team SharePoint? Is it OneDrive because it's got SharePoint in the URL? Is it SharePoint? Or does it mean something else? And so the same thing comes across with Office, right? And so maybe we need to be more detailed. I see the question come in from Alexander. I'm not sure if Power Apps environments will ever be included in group creation. I don't have the answer on that one for it. I haven't seen that on any documentation or roadmaps, so I'm not sure if anyone is aware of that as well. All right. Let's continue on here. I won't bore us with a lot of the SharePoint details. This is more or less for your knowledge and information if you want to step back in. But of course, SharePoint can be used for a lot of different things. From an organizational aspect of it, it's a lot easier to implement than it was before. And so I think that's a key item for it. And that's where the core collaboration does come through. The one item to make mention of is identifying your collaboration strategy. So not only is the what tool to use when, but when we take a step back, maybe when we take the term collaboration, what does that even mean? So in this case of it, this is where we have the ability to come in and say, all right, is it in OneDrive, Teams, or SharePoint? And what are the key elements or key features for users? Again, what you're catching here is if we're going to communicate it to our users, the key items here in terms of how simple can we make it for users. And what I really like about this diagram is the aspect across the very bottom here. This really helps identify when I should use it. Is it more formal, less formal? Should it be managed by the user, smaller group of people involved all together? So that's probably the key item here to think about is, where is those differences? How do we focus those through? All right. 5 ways that our organization, or collaboration rather, can empower our organization. And so I think the key item is technical skill is minimal to do this. So as long as we're familiar with technology, we're good. Should be based on workflow needs, whether it's communication or collaboration or document management. If it's deployed correctly, you as IT administrators should not have to deal with updating our content, updating permissions, maintaining a document repository. If you're going into permissions and modifying permissions on a regular basis, and you can define what you mean by regular, honestly, anything probably more than ever, then you are not doing it correctly. So if you're able to maintain those permissions either in group level or provide users some guidance to manage their own permissions, that's going to allow you to focus in on what really matters, and that's making the technology work and set it up in a meaningful manner for users. Managing information, of course, the key items there is understand the process, right? What is the schedule? When do they check in, check out? Is there version control, content approval? So all of these features are still available. When does it make sense to tell users to use them? And so that's some of the items here that we'll talk about in a demo. Facilitate team collaboration here, I think is important, obviously, to focus in on as well. And so those are all key items for us to take a peek at and to keep track of. Enhancing communication, finding the right information, assigning appropriate permissions and privileges based upon the information needs for us. And we're going to see a lot of those items here when we jump into our demo here after number 5, which is the idea of automating business processes. And so when I think about the idea of automating business processes, that's really the focus in on what are some of those light lift items? How can we either have a quick item of approved and rejected, for instance, to keep that process as quick as possible. If you're sending a file off to somebody to review and not using an automated process to do that, you're instantly breaking that rule of instant gratification, right? There's no way to track where it's at. I think back to how you may have done things in the past. For those of you that don't know, I was a high school teacher previously in the early 2000s. And when I needed to do something, I would fill out a form, put it in one of those inner department or inner office manila envelopes, write who it's to, use the string to figure 8 it, and then put it in the district mail. And then it would route to whoever. I have no idea where it's at in the process. If you're still doing that, that's taking some time. Then it went to email, right? And now the idea here is coming through and actually, configuring it or setting it up from that approval process. In fact, whatever happened to all those inner office manila envelopes that were used over and over and over again? All right. I didn't think I'd bring that up today, but here is our process. So let's jump into the demo aspect of it. I'm going to go ahead and pull the demo slide up here for us so we have the ability to really know where we're at for it. So when we take a look at the demo aspect of it, here's what we're going to talk about. We're going to take a look at the idea of creating a file locally and saving it directly somewhere, and why that matters and how we can help out. We'll take a look at sharing a file. What does that mean? How do we control that? Co-authoring of files. Where does version control go today? Moving and copying. Adding the SharePoint link to Teams. This is one of those pieces that I think is relatively unknown for a lot of people. Adding SharePoint as a cloud storage directly inside of Teams. Then we'll look at Microsoft Forms. What are the advantages? One of the biggest mistakes I see a lot of organizations make is they're relying heavily on individual forms versus using group created ones. The key item there is no different than if you're relying heavily on OneDrive instead of Teams or SharePoint. When that user gets offboarded, if that user leaves, you lose all of those forms or all those items. And then the other item here to think about is Teams obviously being together as an ecosystem. So we have about 45 minutes left that we're going to run through these different scenarios. So let's go ahead and let's start. Where we're going to start here is with a brand new blank document for us. So I'll go ahead and bring a blank document over. Here's my document on my screen. I'll zoom in on it so it's a little bit larger for you. One of my favorite features that's available inside of Word, if you're not aware, is the dictate functionality and also the reuse files. Just to plug those, reuse files can be really efficient if you're creating an item and need to reuse a file from a different area or content from a different area. So here when we take a look aspect of it for us, this allows me to come through and I can create a quick, we'll just do random text here on the screen. We'll do 5, we'll do 10, perfect. All right, there's my random text. It's a very important document for us. When I have this document created, now I started out with a blank document. You can see it says document 2 up there. When I come in here and I go ahead and jump to the save as area, one of the pieces to make mention of is that you have the ability to have different elements or different locations here. So I can save an item in a recent area. I have the ability to have multiple accounts here, so you can see my multiple accounts, and I can choose this PC. The key item that users miss a lot of times is they forget about what's available there. They forget about the ability to come in here, choose a site, and see either sites that are frequent with inside of their, more or less workload. They also have the ability to see sites that they're following. If you're not familiar with what the definition of following is, let's go ahead and let's take a look at where that's located within inside of SharePoint. So if I bring open a SharePoint instance here real quickly, and I'll save this file here for us. If I take a look at SharePoint, one of the items that's available in the upper right-hand corner is the ability to follow. Now that following makes it easier for me to save sites, or save to the site, I should say. It also makes it easier for me to open up files from the site if I wanted to do that, because it's automatically like a favorite or a shortcut. The other piece where that comes in handy is if I take a look at my sites here. If it loads, there we go. Notice you have a followed section there as well. So that following is really important for you if you need to get back to that same location before. So let's jump back into this document here, and we're going to save it to the landing. We'll choose the document library, and we'll call this the VIP doc. All right. In this case, I'll go ahead and click on save. When I have it created here, now it's saved. So now here's my document that's saved along the way, and I can go ahead and obviously work on this document however I choose. I can add more documents or more items to it. Here is more info. And what's happening, of course, is it's saving across the top of the screen. And we're not going to talk a lot about autosave, but autosave is a hero. No longer can you, give an excuse that you lost your file because your computer died. It does not work anymore because autosave is saving that file for you in real time. Now with that, I'm going to open up a file that I made a few changes to earlier here today. for us. You're going to see it looks somewhat familiar, although it's called important documents, and it's opened up here locally on my computer. The key item here, I think that's also mentioned, is I do have a link created, and there's a guest contributor that's in this file in the web browser for us. That guest contributor is myself in a different browser session for us to see. But here, when we take a look, I think the key item to look at is where's that version history stored? And without going to SharePoint, so this is one piece that I always like to make mention. We've so far saved a file to SharePoint without going to SharePoint, right? And I think that's what a lot of users want to be able to do. They don't want to have to go out to SharePoint to use the tools of SharePoint. When we think about it for us, I can come into the info section specifically, and I can jump into version history. And what you'll notice here is my different files and my different versions. So I can see there's my version, 1.0 up there without my changes. And so version history becomes really important for us to keep track of and be able to see over and over and over again. I can restore or look at a previous version of that file without ever having to open up SharePoint or go to the browser version to make that happen. So again, where that's at from a document perspective is if you come into the File tab, jump into Info, then you'll see version history directly right there. And that version history is going to allow you to look, compare, open up that file for you and see where that file is in real time. Now, if you're interested or curious, what does that look like in the browser version here for us? So here's that same documents. If I go ahead and choose to open it up in the browser version instead of the application, you'll notice the directions are very much the same. File, info, and now I can see version history. Now, the key difference here of you to take a look at is you actually get the ability to see that file in real time. So I can see there's what the initial version looked like. And if I come in here, I can see, oh, there's what the guest contributor added to my file. And I can see it. It's a lightweight track changes, if you will. It's not track changes, but it's lightweight of modifications along the way. So from a version history perspective, telling users or informing users that this is a way that you can approach it really, in my opinion, helps out that collaboration experience for users along the way. Let's take a look at actually going ahead and co-authoring a file. And so I'm going to be very brave here for us. And I'm going to jump back to this document. And you can see there is my guest contributor that's inactive. I'm going to just grab a quick link here for it. And this is anyone. Again, this is a demo environment. So like I said earlier, security is not a concern of mine in this specific session. But I'm going to put the link in our chat window here. If you want to go ahead and join the file, feel free to join the file as well. And I'll get Denise's question here answered real quickly. But specifically, if check-in, check-out is enabled, this breaks. Check-in, check-out is not available. There we go. We can see one brave person jumped in here as well. Yeah, I think you're all going to come in as guest contributors. So please, nobody do anything inappropriate at all. So we can see co-authoring and co-editing coming through here for us. Very brave, I guess, that I'm letting everyone doing this in real time. But Denise, to your specific question in terms of check-in, check-out will essentially disable or restrict the ability for users to co-author as well as autosave. So in my opinion, back in SharePoint's previous days, you used to require that a lot. So you got that version history. Now it should be used very, very sparingly. So if you have libraries or locations where that's turned on, generally, it's a policies and procedures library. It's an area where you want to restrict that autosave aspect of it. But essentially, it will impact that autosave feature altogether. So that's a key item here to take a look at. All right. Thank you. Look at that catchy title. You guys are making this pretty. I should just do this for all of my items so I don't ever have to do any work for it. Oh, somebody put in a picture. Oh, see, look, it looks like outside. How pretty. For at least for those of us in Minnesota, or I guess the upper Midwest, technically. and just be happy we don't live in Buffalo right now with the 3 to 4 feet of snow that's coming. So with that here, as we take a look, of course, co-authoring is very important. If we take a look at this version history here, this is probably one of the more fascinating things that I always like to look at. Is obviously all of us are you know, guest contributors, because I didn't make everyone log in here. But you can start to see those are the different changes that were captured along the way, right? And so I think that's an important item for us to keep track of. Is version history is going to be available for us. It's going to record how that file grew over time along the way. Now, the one other element here, as some of us might still be working, is you'll notice that I jumped into the share aspect of it, and I was kind of careless when it came to the sharing piece of it, just to get everyone in the file as quick as possible. But when we go to share a file, you have a couple different options available. You can choose, depending upon your organization settings, you can choose anyone with the link. You can choose people inside of the organization, for instance. You do have to be careful with both of these. Overall, anyone with a link means that link that I provided means anyone that has it can make changes to this single document. Again, not a huge concern of mine. It's a junk doc, but you got to be careful with that. The other aspect of it is even inside of the organization, you got to be careful with this too, because if I create this link and I send it to a colleague or somebody else that has access to this specific file, and they click on it and open it up, and let's say that that person, you know, is Michael, and Michael opens up that file. When Michael opens up that file, and if somebody's looking at Michael's recent behavior, it's going to also tell them that that file is available to them. And so you got to be careful with that too. So my recommendation is to always use the specific people if you're going ahead and sharing it. Now, I, of course, did that from the browser version. I could do that from the desktop if I'd like to as well, overall. The other item to make mention of is, of course, the ability to do other settings. And again, if you're not an admin inside of your organization, you may or may not have the ability to control the behavior of the sharing options that's available to you. So with that, thank you for those of you that jumped in and participated. There we go. We can see that. Now, when we take a look at our files overall, I want to just jump in and make a quick comment here for us. When I go ahead and create a comment along the way, I do have the ability to mention or bring in another person. So if I wanted to mention, this is our family account overall that I use for demo purposes. So if I wanted to mention Christine, I could do that. The one item that's available for us as well is I can also assign a task now. So for any of you that struggle with the definition of how to create an ask, or take an ask rather, and turn it into a task, this is an element or a feature that's available for you as well now. And so this is a key item here for us to go ahead and make that method be available for you. So here's where I can go ahead and assign a task to somebody else. I previously did a talk for the user group, I think in the summertime, on task management in 365 that's recorded and available on their YouTube channel. So I encourage you to watch that if you're interested in that. But again, mentioning someone will trigger and toggle an email to that person, letting them know that I'm interested in that file or interested in that specific area. So with that, I'm going to close out of this item here specifically. And we're going to continue on into the file area here. Actually, I'll go ahead and save this comment here real quickly. There we go. Notice what it did there. Let me actually do another one here. I jumped through that a little bit quicker. But this is one of the newer pieces that I really like. We'll go and insert a comment in here. I'm not used to the browser version, I'm sorry. If I go ahead and bring in Olivia, for instance, and I click on post comment, of course, it's not going to show me that message for it. There was a message that popped up previously that said, it looks like that person doesn't have access. Do you want to grant access to that individual? That's probably the biggest item to be aware of. Actually, let me do one more here. Let me just pick, there we go. There we go. This is, I think, an important item to think about. Microsoft is making it really, really easy for you to share items and provide access to things. which is good. However, it also can create a lot of unique permissions to files. So in this case of it, you'll need to obviously share and notify the individual in this case, because if I don't share the file with them, they won't have access to actually see the comment along the way. So that's where you can choose to share and notify. I'm going to choose not to go forward with that change here for us. We'll cancel the draft, maybe. Bueller, come on. Well, we'll just close out of it and we'll choose to leave for it. All right. Hopefully that was good to see some of those examples. Feel free to use that if you want to, or continue to go through that file. If anyone makes any other changes, we certainly can take a look at. The next item here that we're going to talk about in terms of collaboration is the idea that I really like, and that's the concept of taking a file from one location and moving it or copying it to another location. And so this is where we can take that file, like VIP doc that I was working on. And if I'm inside of SharePoint or OneDrive or Teams, you'll notice across the top portion of the screen is the ability for us to move or copy that file to another location. And so when you think about using our files overall, this is an important item for us, is that we may create them locally, or why some people save them locally on their desktop or in their OneDrive is they're not ready for prime time, or they're not ready to share yet. And so this is where we can actually choose to go ahead and move that file or copy that to another location. Now with that here, as we take a look at the idea of moving and copying, I think this is an important kind of diagram to unpack here for us, is that when you start to use your files, you have the ability to move them or copy them in different areas or different components. And so in this case of it here, I have the ability to move that file or move that to a different location. I can start it in OneDrive and move it to SharePoint. I can start it in OneDrive and move it to Teams. And then of course I have the ability to do backwards as well if I wanted to make that happen. Samantha, I'll get to your question here as well in just a second, because I think this is going to be a key element for you to be aware of along the way. So here's where, the permissions and those types of items can be a little bit messy when you start to move files, as well as the comments for us. So let's take a step back. Let's take a look at that first question that's out there in terms of the permissions. So I'm going to go ahead. Remember, I clicked to share that file with Christine. So if I go and I take a look at managing our access to the file, here I can see the link that all of you are using. Down here, here's the link of Christine that it generated. So it generated a direct access to Christine. It did not generate access to the location though, just to the actual file itself, right? So it would be no different than me coming in and clicking share to that location, to that specific file, I should say, not to the location. So that is one item to be aware of here as well. The one other item I want to make mention of is if I go ahead and I choose to say, let's move this file to a different location altogether, and let's move it to a separate site altogether, like this M365 Champions. Notice across the bottom, when you go to move files, you have the ability to keep the permissions in place, which, depending upon what you want, that's either a good or a bad thing. So you got to be careful with that, right? So permissions are really important for it. Although we're talking about how easy it is to bring someone into a file, how easy it is to share a file externally, right? What did I start the topic about? We're going to do some things, and permissions and security are going to be not in our focus. And so with that, we do have to be aware of what we're doing. So if I come in here and say, I'm not going to keep sharing that file, what's going to happen is that person's going to lose access to that file, which may be what you want to have happen. But if those individuals are not part of the team, part of the SharePoint site, part of the location, and I move that file, they're going to lose access, or in this case, they're going to still have access, but that file is going to be unique permissions again. And so hopefully, Samantha, that answered your question in terms of it. It did not grant access to the container. It does not do that. It looks at the item individually for you to be aware of. So hopefully that answered your question for you to take a look at. But again, when I go to move a file, I have the option to choose what happens. So if I say keep it, I can choose to move it, and I could move it along the way. My guess is, since some of you, one of you, or I'm in it still, it's probably going to balk and yell at me and tell me I can't move the file because somebody's still in the file. Maybe. We'll see. I always like to test. I guess it moved it, but I think I checked the box to let it happen. So I probably just moved it to a separate site altogether, and gave you access to that specific file in a different location. All right. With that here, let's more or less continue on down with some of the different demo and items that are available for us. We're going to jump to the Teams element here, and then we'll come back into Forms here in just a moment. But when we take a look at the Teams element, for the key item for us is when we have Teams available, there's a few pieces. I'll jump into shared channels here real quickly as an example so you can see what that process looks like. But if I jump into, a team for us like M365 Champions, and I jump into the files portion of it, I think this is one of the more unknown features that's available for you. Have you ever needed to use files that are not located in Teams, but you want to use Teams to get there because you're in Teams for every single thing of your life? The quick answer here for us is to use the concept called add cloud storage. When we go to add cloud storage, this is creating a shortcut to that location for us. And so if you're someone like myself where you have access to a lot of different SharePoint sites, or your team has access to a lot of different SharePoint sites, and you don't want to move the files out of there, but you want to bring them into Teams because that's where you're looking for them, then adding cloud storage is going to be the advantage for you. Now, there are other tools that you can use, obviously other third-party applications besides SharePoint, or Microsoft-specific tools here. But if I go ahead and jump into SharePoint here, this is where I can go ahead and use another SharePoint link, or here's that landing element here as well. When I jump into the landing portion of it, this is where I can jump into next. I can choose which library I want to bring in, and I can click next and choose add folder. Now, when I did that here, this is where I have the ability to jump into our landing documents for us. And again, I have it open on another tab, so I'll split my screen here so you can see them in more than one spot. When I click on the landing documents, here's the files. Here's that very important document I created. Of course, here's my folders. There's the same items there as well. So again, from a user perspective, I don't have to jump and find that location in SharePoint to use SharePoint overall. So if you're someone that has a specific location, or you access those items and need to be able to find them a little bit easier, that add to cloud storage is going to save you quite a bit of time for us to take a look at and see. So again, this is where I can easily jump in, access the files, collaborate on the files all together, open up that VIP document here real quickly. There I am opening it up. Of course, if I had my default behavior in the Teams desktop app set to open it up locally, it would continue to work. I can, jump in the specific file. I can make changes. I can do everything I want to do in regards to that file, just like I would for it. That file, though, keep in mind, if I go to the info section for it, and I'm not getting the path here for it. Let me see if I can get the path. There we go. That file is not stored in the team. It's stored in the SharePoint site. So again, when we take a look at this aspect of it, I think that's probably the most valuable piece to be aware of here for us, is that when we're working on files, we can bring those locations in from other areas and not have to worry about it, or not have to be focusing on that. All right. Let's take a step away from files here for a moment, and we'll jump into the concept of forms and how those can work for us as well. There was a comment earlier. I just want to find it here real quickly. The Power Automate processes and forms being under named account have been the biggest limiting factor of us adopting them for more business processes. Yeah, I would agree, Adam. I think, when we think about where those are at and how those access, that's probably the biggest or one of the biggest concerns for it is just kind of the architecture in terms of that for you. So I would echo that similar statement for it. I do think the idea of converting forms from a personal to a shared instance is probably important to help out with some of that. When we think about business processes, I think that takes a little bit bigger of a discussion for it. So I'll give you a like here for you as well on your chat. So thank you for that comment. One of the pieces when you go ahead and create a form, I think the item that we always typically kind of dive into is just at the top here. I click on new form. If I take a step back for it, one of the elements that I think is important here is to actually come down and to take a look at our groups. And so I have a form here created in our deployment team. So I'm going to go ahead and let's hope my permissions stick. There we go. So this is where I have the ability to create a new group form. And a group form is tied to the group. So anyone that has access to the group will have access to the form. Again, the same element comes in the aspect of making sure that you're not, sharing something, or it's not owned by an individual here. It's owned by the group of people instead. So if I take a look at it, I can create a new group form, new group quiz. The elements and the experience are very much the same. Now, one of the pieces, I'm going to close out of this here real quick, and I'm going to jump back to a form that's already created because this is not a form session here. But if I have a survey here, here's my quick form that I have available. One of the items I like to make mention of is if you do need to jump into the form settings, this is where you can choose to collaborate or duplicate those forms. So maybe you build a form in one team or in one group and you need to move it to another. You can choose to do that. I can choose to share it as a template. I can create a group there as well. And anyone with the link can duplicate that form for it. So again, in this case of it, this is where you can choose to copy that form. And if I go ahead and copy that and bring that in, there's my form overall, and then I can choose to create a copy or duplicate. I don't think it copied it successfully for me for it, but I do have the ability to make that happen. So I do think saving a form and having a form be a part of a group is a little bit more efficient when it comes to collecting that data. What it does not require you to do is if I come in and take a look at an individual item here, it does not require me to come in and share that form, right? So I don't have to worry about sharing that form with an individual. I don't have to make sure that a user has access to trigger all the responses or that item is only available to me. So by having it as part of a group does allow it to make it a little bit more efficient in terms of exporting and seeing some of those results overall. And so that can help with the collaboration aspect of it. For it is that by using a group form, you have the ability then for users to easily jump in and access those items. All right. Let's move into one of my favorite features here for us. So when we take a look at some of the items here that can help out with collaboration for it, and we have, I'll say, about 10 minutes left here from a topic perspective. So we'll let everyone disconnect at closer to noon here. So if you need to grab a quick bite from wherever, so you can join the 12 o'clock, that's great. When we think about the idea for us to take a look at the concept of how do we communicate or how do we, access things a little bit more important for us, I'm going to go ahead and, take a look at an item from Chris here overall. There we go. I can see Chris, I love you too on a quick meme. One of the things to think about here is that I have the ability to do a couple things directly here. From a collaboration aspect of it, this is where somebody may take something in a group chat, maybe it's an individual chat, and I need to make sure it's documented and share it for others from a collaboration aspect of it. This is where I'm going to go ahead and say I'm going to create a quick task. Now, when I create a task for us, this is where I have the ability to jump in and create a quick task name. If you had a task name there, it would be there, but I'll go ahead and call it chat follow-up. I can choose where that task gets saved. Now, from a collaboration perspective, if I save it into my tasks portions of it, that's only for me, myself personally. That's probably not what you want to look at. When you save an item from a tasks perspective, you probably want to have that go to a shared instance or a shared area. So if I choose presentation demo, where does that go? Well, that's a shared task list that I have already previously created. But what I really like for it is that I can actually come in, save it to a deployment team, and here are a couple different planners that are available or tagged with inside of that specific area. So if I choose chat, teams, and channels, that came out of the general channel. So if we take a step back here real quick, let me jump into teams here. I was playing around with policies, so that's why it's a little bit funky here. But if I come up to general portion of it and I jump into that chat, teams, and channels, here is that planner. So again, from a collaboration perspective, what bucket do I want to put that into? I'll just say set up this planner. We'll go ahead and we'll say it's in progress, and we'll say the due date is today. And then in this case of it, I can go ahead and not add a task. Why can't I add a task here? I got to give it a name. It didn't save my name. There we go. Now I can click add task. Now, when I do that, what am I doing, right? I'm taking this specific item and I'm adding a task for it. Come on. There it goes. Almost quick. Now here's my chat follow-up. So again, I can take something from a collaboration aspect of it. One of the complaints that I hear from a lot of people is we use chat back and forth a lot. It's a really good way to collaborate, but there's no measurement on if somebody gets something done. And so by taking that outside and using a Power Automate to make that happen, what you're doing then is you're allowing yourself to say, all right, that's great. And maybe I want to add to that flow a little bit and say, I'm going to, whenever I do that, it's going to say, here's the task and here's the link that's been created. You could build that out a little bit further. But what you're doing here is you're taking that quick ask or that quick item and you're adding it and you're documenting when that is, right? So now I can say it's done for it. And now my task is completed. So I think that's a really neat item to really be aware of here. If I jump back into chat here real quick, what did I do specifically? Is if I come in here to the more actions, I use the create a task, but you can create additional new actions for it. And again, this can be a group item, this could be an individual item for you, but it's a nice way for you to go ahead and pull those items and have them documented somewhere else as well. So that is a kind of a neat element to be aware of from a collaboration. The other piece from a collaboration that I'll just quickly talk about, because I know there's other sessions on this as well, is the concept of Microsoft Loop. So this is a piece where you can see that Maddie on Tuesday shared a loop element with me in terms of Microsoft or inside of To Do. This allows me to go ahead and add different items to it. And from a collaboration piece of it, this can really be an effective way to collaborate or to work together in real time. Similar to co-authoring, but I don't have to jump into a document to make that happen. I can do that all directly here. I'm excited to see where this grows over time in terms of where those items come in for us as well. All right. With that, let's transition back to our slideshow here so we can talk through some of the different elements and different components for us here. Just get my slideshow started back up. Perfect. So those are the few items that we talked through from a demo perspective. So we took a look at our files and we jumped into our files aspect of it. We created some files locally, saved them directly into SharePoint. That's an important aspect for us to be aware of. We talked about Microsoft Forms. We took a look at some Teams elements for us in terms of where those come in. The key item I think that's really important is the whole definition of use cases. So when we take a look at a summary aspect of it, when we think about what happens here, I think you have to separate in what is the specific, process or what is the specific item that you're trying to simplify. So from a collaboration aspect of it, that term is very, very broad. But if we dive deeper into it, where do we need to collaborate better? Is it in project related? So are we looking at tasks? Are we looking at documents? Are we talking about check-in meetings overall? If we jump into sales aspect of it, where are we looking at that? Is it the idea of our, is it a cycle like what we're talking about here? How can we identify and define that process a little bit more, specifically from there? Maybe the collaboration on how what you're doing today is all in email. And so if we're sending a quick email and we're doing this whole process through email, it's maybe inefficient. So how can we kind of offload some of those elements periodically? Maybe not doing everything all the time. Maybe we take off little chunks along the way. When we talk about cultural transformation, this is a huge topic for a lot of organizations today. How do we keep our team more engaged? And one of the pieces that I'm really excited, and I have not tried it out yet, that was introduced, and if any of you have, I'd be interested to hear feedback, is the games, was it Games for Work, I think is what it's called, but the ability to have Solitaire and Minesweeper and some of those classic Windows games available for you with inside of a Teams meeting to work, right? What does that engagement look like? I think that's a key element of collaboration is each and every single group you work with, collaboration means a little bit different. We focus in on the document side of it quite a bit and how you can be more efficient in terms of what that means for collaboration. But maybe it's the engagement side. How do I get more people engaged when I'm offering large meetings or large sessions? Am I going to create a shared whiteboard in some of those instances? And if we had time, we could probably spend and go through each of those individual elements along the way. I do have a series of links, though, for us at the very end that are available in the deck as well. When we think about it here, this is the other items here for us is a lot of the different departments and industries and some of the core topics that are out there. So what are those, right? Marketing, sales, human resources. And so when we think about teams is a really good kind of ecosystem holding of that collaboration experience. But I think it's also important for us to think through really that process overall and where does the items belong? So is it a team? Is it an ad hoc process altogether? The last thing here to talk through, I should say, is just some of the resources that are out there. I'm a huge fan of reusing things that are out there that Microsoft provides. And it's not just one item or not just one posting. Microsoft does have a series of best practices for collaborating with inside of 365. Kind of a deep dive on collaborating with files. And then the other item is that governance piece. So although that's available for you, how can you make sure that it's in a secure manner altogether? So with that, that concludes my talk here. I do want to be respectful of time and understand that, I've asked you to pay attention for the last 75 minutes for it. And I know that we have obviously some items before the lunch keynote to go over. So Teresa, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pat. I always loved listening to you. So any other questions for Pat before we go into the $25 gift card? Again, please make sure that you complete the survey. It's important for us to do that. Okay. So the winner of the gift card is Maddie Dahl. So Maddie, if you would drop me your email address, I would appreciate that. You can do that in a private chat. So next up is we have the keynote that'll be starting at noon. It's collaboration track with information on Microsoft Lists and Microsoft Teams. So that'll be a great session for us to learn how to leverage that more. Any questions, guys? Okay. The recording will be available in a couple of days.